By the way, this pre-intro you're going to hear is it's the CDC director. I thought it was apropos.
I'm going to pause here. I'm going to lose the script, and I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom.
Welcome to Presbycast. If you weren't quite prepared for that act of depression coming straight from our intro music, we assure you that we are only chasing safety, and we applaud you for being here with us as we have your best interests at heart. No matter what the changing of the times may have in store for us, but I'm Presbyterian. Chortles is here as well. Welcome to everyone who is watching along live with us on YouTube and contributing in the comments there. Say something we find worthwhile. It doesn't even have to be intelligent, and we might throw it up along the bottom banner for a second or two. But we have two returning guests, but in the spirit of WrestleMania week, we are putting together combinations and matchups that have never before been seen on Presbycast, and so we're gonna have sort of a debut formation going on here. But Chortles, go ahead and introduce our guests and our topic, and let's see where we end up.
Well, it's tumultuous in the PNR world these days. People talking about leaving, reaffiliating, changing things. And it's really a serious subject, and a lot of people who talk about it, I don't think they've, I don't want to be arrogant, but I don't think they've all thought about it very well. And I have no personal desire to separate from anyone. But that's where we find ourselves. And whether this is the result of an acrimonious political climate or long trends, I can't say. But it's good to have the opinion of others. We first ask our old internet buddy, Dr. Daryl Hart, to join us. And then a moment of inspiration today, I decided we would bring Dr. Dominic Aquila on as well to sort of be part of the panel and ask Dr. Hart questions. And it'll probably be the best show if Dr. Aquila interviews Dr. Hart and we just log off. And you're there, Daryl?
People said they liked our episode last week, so
yeah,
I feel like we can really only go up.
That's right. So
that was a good show last week. Actually, I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it's one of, you finish the show and you think, boy, was that the best or the worst we've ever done?
Really?
Yeah, and there's not that much difference between the best and the worst. But
It's a very thin line.
Are you with us there, Dr. Aquila?
Yes, I'm here, and I'm not sure where I fit in because I missed last week, so
Oh, no,
I don't
no.
know I have any pretensions here about what he or anything to measure it against. Anyway,
The best way to recommend the show would be like go 24 hours without drinking any water, and then don't take a really hot shower, and then eat the most like sugar-filled item you can find, and then turn it on, and that's probably the best way to replicate it.
Gotcha. It's good.
All right, well, it's good to have you both, and I'm thinking about times of schism and separation, all that sort of thing. So I immediately thought Dr. Hart, the author of Machen, and I'm sure you've thought about these things. You also personally separated from the CRC at some point. So, I mean, I guess the first question I have, how analogous, of course, we're talking about the PCA largely here. How analogous is the situation in the PCA or any NAPARC church today compared to what Machen faced? I'm not sure maybe there is a good comparison, but what do you think, Doctor?
Well, if the missions controversy had not become what it emerged to be, which meant that members of the independent board, which was, sort of an act of aggression, you could argue, formed in 1933 because the Foreign Missions Board of PCUSA was seemingly liberal. I mean, I think there was pretty good evidence for that. So when the General Assembly decided to bring those renegades to trial, and then you have people forced out of the church, doesn't mean they have to form a new church, but you do have lines drawn there in ways that, for instance, with the URC leaving the CRC, it was just kind of a trickle of congregations out beginning in the early 90s, down for the subsequent 15, 20 years, and then forming the URC. And so it's hard. I mean, what that means is you just don't have that kind of founding moment. And I think there are a number of issues in the PCA that could be a kind of line in the sand, and that people could then begin to do what the PCA did originally, which was to form, I don't remember all the names of the conservative organizations, but to have those organizations in place such that if the General Assembly did this and this, then that sort of a set of procedures or set of steps in place. And I think from what I see in the PCA, those issues could well emerge, or maybe already have emerged. It will depend, I guess, in many respects on how they play out in the courts of the church and what the leadership will be for setting up some sort of alternative structures. And, it's a kind of, the equivalent of like a Continental Congress or something like that, if we don't get our independence, this is what we will go back to. So again, I think the big difference, though, is whether there is that defining moment, which the OPC had, and versus the one, say, that the URC has faced, which has been much more gradual and up to congregations to decide to leave and then realign with someone else.
Well, we need to remember that the PCUSA of Machen's day had utterly lost the gospel. They expressed in the Auburn Affirmation and had no regard for Scripture or very little. It was just a kind of a piece of their program, but didn't have a view of of the inerrancy of Scripture. Of course, that's sort of a modern word, but they wouldn't have recognized it the way we use it. But it's
Hey,
still,
Chortles, you're sounding like like an OPCer on that one.
yeah,
That they'd
yeah.
lost the gospel. I mean, I only say that because John Gerstner, who stayed in the PCUSA for most of his life, kept saying through the 50s, 60s, 70s that the PCUSA had never repudiated the Westminster Standards, even with the confessions, the Book of Confessions of 67 and the new Confession of Faith. I think part of his argument was, well, the Westminster Confession is still there. So if that's, anyway, and the Auburn Affirmation didn't take away the Westminster Confession, but I'm more on your side. I'm just observing that you might find a home in the OPC.
Well, not if they do their research. I'm quite sure. And we'll
We have many ex-Baptists. I'm one of them.
Shoot, if they let me in.
Well, I haven't seen any official document. Dr. Quill, what do you think about analogies? Of course, in your case, you started or were on the way to starting into ministry in the U.S., I think. And do you think that is there any analogy between 1973 and, let's say, looking ahead, 2023, if that were to be the time there was going to be a division?
Well, yeah, I think there are some similarities going on at different issues in one sense, and yet the same issues. I became a believer through the ministry of a PCUS, a Southern Presbyterian Church in Miami, and I was blessed to be in a church that took seriously discipling their kids. Their children. I was 16, but it was taken under wing very quickly, and so I was exposed to the Westminster Confession and other things. In fact, one of the first books I think I read as a brand new believer was Redemption, Accomplishment, Applied, John Murray's book, and that, of course, I was brand new and I didn't know all the lingo and all the evangelical words and whatnot, but I got the drift and the sense of what he was saying. That gave me, I think, laid a foundation that I wasn't aware of at that point what it meant, but it surely did. And not too long after I was converted, I felt called to ministry. And again, I didn't know the evangelical lingo to be able to even describe it. And as these other individuals were telling me, well, this is how God chooses to work, and so forth and so on. So anyway, I paid attention to what was taking place during high school, and then went to college. And while I was there, this is in the middle 60s, that already there were some things that were in place. So when Dr. Hart mentioned were the things that were in place already were the Presbyterian Journal. Back then, initially it was called the Southern Presbyterian Journal because it was coming from the Southern Presbyterian Church. And it started in the late 40s because there were already signs of issues in the PCUS that created a stir. And so in the First Presbyterian Church of Weaverville, North Carolina, in the basement, Henry Dendy started, turning out, and then the old Blue Spirit machine, the Presbyterian Journal, and trying to alert people to be faithful to Scripture, because already began to see some inroads from the liberal side, coming a lot from Ernest Trice Thompson's and his group, the Fellowship of St. James. And he taught church history at Union Seminary. So and they were the young bucks of the day. And they gathered the guys together, and they had been influenced a lot by European liberalism. And so they saw those encroachments coming in the life of the church. So that actually begins it. So I was cutting my teeth as far as just learning about the church at large through reading the Presbyterian Journal, and also being around individual pastors that were committed to the Reformed faith. And so the thing that probably set it off more than anything else, probably a couple of things. One is the almost close possibility of a union with the PCUSA. And that there was a great deal of fighting, and so the conservatives were still strong enough that they were able to stall it, or actually kill that proposal. But it created a lot of damage. The women ordained as deacons also came along, and then of course they were moving, as the PCUSA had already moved to women elders, and they were pushing in that direction as well. So all that was in place pretty well, late 50s, early 60s. And of course, that's getting ready for the PCA, which would start in 73. So you could see that kind of thing that, developing. And I was living through, all of those events.
But the liberals of the 1960s PCUS, the old Southern Church, pre-reunion, they don't resemble the progressives in the PCA theologically. I don't think that much. I think it's more. Is it more methodological? Is that?
No, I think they did. I mean, the issues may be different, but the thing that was the encroachment was the neo-orthodoxy was very, very popular, and so, and as I think I've shared on this program before, in 1963, the Presbyterian Survey, which was the denominational magazine for the Southern Presbyterian Church, had one of its numbers, volumes, that article that asked the question, do we need an infallible Bible? And they asked the systematic theology professors of the 4 denominational seminaries, which was Louisville, Presbyterian Church Seminary in Louisville, Union Seminary in Richmond, Columbia Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and Austin in Texas, to write articles answering that question. And he said that the answer, basically each one of those men said, yes, we don't need an infallible Bible. They answered it that way. And it shocked him because, and that was in 63. So that really laid a strong foundation. Plus what they were teaching was strongly influenced by neo-orthodoxy as well. And so now you were having the questioning of the bodily resurrection of Christ, and making that division that using Francis Schaeffer's terms of the lower story, the upper story, that in real history, the Jesus of history didn't rise from the dead, but in the upper story, the Christ of faith did. And so those things were, being promulgated. Just one illustration of this. The people in the pew weren't that aware of terminologies like neo-orthodoxy and so forth. But I can still remember, for instance, a church in Miami, that's where I grew up, that had a pastor who had served very faithfully for many years, and then he retired. And it was a church of about 900, and a very prominent church in the presbytery and in the denomination. And then they did their search for a pastor, and they called a man from a church out of Jacksonville. And he was very, just in terms of the stature and his physical stature, as well as his voice and everything about him, was very polished and very commanding. You paid attention to what he said because of the way he said things. And within 3 years, that church was down to 300. Now, the people began leaving out the back door. They heard him say things, that Jesus rose from the dead and the Bible is God's word, or it contains God's words. He used all the neo-orthodox jargon. They didn't know what was going on. All they knew is whatever he was saying did not have the force and power that they heard from the pastor before, who was a faithful Bible teacher. And so they began going to other Presbyterian churches in the area. So they impacted the area, and a lot of them came, well trained in that regard, even though they would have known the theological terms like neo-orthodoxy and the like. And that church today, that one that had 900 within 3 years was down to 300, was is still in existence, and it's down to about 50. They are well endowed, so they could live forever, type go on with all the old money. And when the Ellen was on her doing her sitcom, and there was the coming out thing, that church had a showing of it. Everyone could come who wanted to that church, and that's where it wound up, and they saw the coming out and had a celebration and that kind of thing. So I saw the progression of that church from the mid 1960s all the way until whenever that Ellen DeGeneres sitcom came. They got coming out of Ellen, and by the way, they also had a clergy couple, and this clergy couple both they'd met Princeton, and they wound up divorcing, and the wife continued as the pastor. The husband got kicked out, and so anyway, it's just a lot of those. That's just an illustration of the kind of stuff that was, things that were happening that might be different kinds of things, but they were comparable in the sense of moving away from the authority of Scripture, desiring women to take more role in the church, especially as elders, and then eventually as ministers as well.
Yeah, we'll get back to those issues. Dr. Darrell, if Machen was alive today and he was in the PCA, would he think that the PCA had lost the gospel, in which the PCA has not lost the gospel? Would he think he should move on somewhere else?
I don't think he'd think he should move on. I think he would think he should try to reform the church. People who opposed Machen and people who are critical of Machen think that he precipitated leaving the church by forming the independent board, which is a plausible argument to a certain extent. On the other hand, he could argue that he was tried and found guilty and booted out of the church because of his trial and the upholding of that verdict by the 1936 General Assembly. But there were people who said to him even back in the 20s after he wrote Christianity and Liberalism, well, why don't you leave now? You think it's so bad. And I don't know that it was necessarily any worse in the 1930s than it was in the 1920s, although you had more evidence, especially with rethinking missions, and completely redoing of the rationale for foreign missions, away from traditional ideas of salvation to humanitarian and civilizational uplift. But he thought he should stay in and fight. And, people would have said, oh, he's being a pain in the neck. And maybe he enjoyed being a pain in the neck. But you stay in as long as you can until they force you out. Because you're fighting for the peace and the purity. It's not just the peace, it's also the purity of the church. And he argued that he had taken vows to uphold the purity of the church as well. So I don't know that I don't think he would try to leave. I think he would try some other maneuvers now, whether it be through overtures, actions at Presbytery level, depending on where his credentials were, obviously.
The throwing of stools.
Yeah. But I think back to your point about abandoning the gospel, whether the PCUSA had done that in the 1920s or whether the PCA has done it now. I guess, what I don't understand is if you were reformed according to the confessions or a confession and catechism, why you wouldn't see problems in the sorts of endeavors like revoice, like critical race theory, why you wouldn't just see out of hand that those are theological problems, and we're going to have to do a lot of work to make that fit, if it could even be done. And that to me is sort of question then of, well, why do people see that these things are possible? It just doesn't seem
Well,
conceivable.
not possible, but essential. I mean, some
Right.
people think that. I think there's a, and I'll unmute Dr. Quillup, and he can chime in here as well. It's almost like it's a there is a philosophy of ministry. Now, I actually don't like that term, but there's a philosophy of ministry, which I would trace back to a certain kind of Kuyperianism gone to seed, or some of the ideas of Francis Schaeffer of cultural engagement and contextualization that could be. I mean, that I think these guys think that their philosophy of ministry and their understanding of the church and the world is that we have to do these things. Dr. Quilla, I mean, do you see it that way?
Yes, partly, but maybe to ask Dr. Hart on this question, and I always say that there's and sort of built into the DNA of Presbyterianism division, because there's going to be the old fight between what the old phrase of between strict subscriptionism and loose subscriptionism that we think we resolved in the PCA by coming up with this good faith subscription, which in reality is a sort of loose subscription with a little dash of strict in it. And so the old school, new school concept that came up, especially developed more in the 19th century, the latter part, and it seems like some of the same principles that were reflected in those two schools seem to be what keeps coming back up again. And
Right.
Maybe it's part of who we are.
I guess I tend to think that and agree with that. On the other hand, it does seem at times that, I mean, I'm trying to think in the case of New School Presbyterianism, say in the 1830s, when the controversy was existing, what would have been the equivalent of critical race theory that New Schoolers would have said, we need to get behind this? Maybe it was abolitionism, although I don't think the New School was overwhelmingly abolitionist. I think there were some New Schoolers who were abolitionist. And I'm part of my reflection is just coming at a time when I'm really scratching my head. I never thought we would see the sorts of categorizing of just sort of seemingly benign aspects of culture or politics, from, say, at the trivial level, a MAGA hat, which means fascism, to the Georgia election laws. And I don't mean to get political, but and then Major League Baseball pulling the All-Star game out of it. It just seems like every day there's a new sort of ratcheting up of political, cultural matters that have attributed to them the worst possible significance, and that worst possible significance is racist, is white supremacist, it is Christian nationalist, or whatever. And it's just a drumbeat at so many of the elite institutions of society. And it's hard for me not to think that what's going on in certain sectors of the PCA is being caught up in that. And therefore, back to Chortle's point about it's essential to ministering in this society and being having a place at the table or being a transformer in some way, is to be able to speak with that set of ideas or impulses rather than coming out against it.
What about this with the 1837 the motion that I think Charles Hodge, brought in, probably in conjunction with Thornwell, to break the union that of 1801 with the Congregational Church, and what that implied, because they perceived that the theology of the Congregational Church was dragging the Presbyterian Church down because of the shifts that had taken place. And so that may be the 1830s. It was centered in that, and so it had more of a theological bent, a difference of theology.
Yes, that's why I'm struggling to think of, say, when it comes to issues of same-sex attraction and or matters of surrounding race relations. I don't see that as much of a factor in the 1830s with the New School. Right. Now, I mean, you could argue that eventually the New School, and I don't know if we'll get the ad for the slippery slope coat or whatever here, but you could argue the New School is
slope coat. Yeah, slope coat
is a slippery slope to liberalism. But I still think that it was more theological and denominational than, say, I'm not saying what's happening in the PCA isn't attempting to be theological or attempting to be denominational, but it has such a wider reference to other trends in higher education, the media, and political parties, particularly the Democratic Party, that it just seems very different.
The way, what I think I'm saying is that the generic, the way I put it would be that old school Presbyterians basically were saying that the confession of faith does give us a standard exposition of Scripture that gives us a classic Calvinism, and it gives us direction for our ministries, that then speaks to how we handle things culturally. New schoolers would basically say something that the confession is nice, but it's more suggestive than it is a mandate that guides us along the way. So they're more open to whatever is happening on the cultural sphere, more accommodationist, the way I would see it. So that by the time you get to the latter part after the Civil War, the thing that's sort of bubbling to the surface now is that whole debate between Christianity and science, faith and science, and the Darwinism that was coming up. And New Schoolers tend to be at least more open to that than, say, the old schoolers, that kind of thing. And then you come into the 20th century and you have the more, the early 20th, the so-called social gospel that it sort of brings us into what Machen was dealing with, part of what he was dealing with in the teens and then into the 20s. But it had still a theological side to it because of the essentials of the faith, the fundamental principles of the authority of Scripture, resurrection of Christ, the virgin birth and things like that.
Right. Although I would throw in there today something that came up in even classes at Hillsdale, in my Western Heritage 2 class. We were doing a section of readings on progress, and I'm using a reader put together by another department member. And it was Harry Emerson Fosdick Day. Even though this course largely covers European history, a few American elements thrown in here and there, but we read Fosdick's Shall the Fundamentalists Win? We read a piece about eugenics, and Fosdick was a supporter of eugenics. Mm-hmm. And we also read a piece about a peace pact that was heralding the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which basically said all nations that signed this pact would not carry out their disagreements by going to war. They would seek other means. And this becomes a basis for actually war crimes after this, that if somebody goes to war, conceivably in the court of some kind of universal global court, you could bring people to trial for a crime against this pact. And Fosdick was a supporter of this anyway. So theological liberalism or modernism in the 20s was also being carried along by what I would argue were some fairly radical or progressive, or however you want to put it, but political impulses that I think were very much contrary to the Anglo-American tradition of politics. That's something that we miss. And I think Machen was actually picking up on the political dimension of it.
Oh, excuse me.
Even the introduction to Christianity liberalism, as well as the conclusion where he brings up Civil War and Battle Hymn of the Republic, only indirectly does he bring up those things. So I do think that Machen also had a political outlook that was informing the way he was seeing currents in the PCUSA in the 20s. Which,
okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I guess I'm saying is that there's been at least an openness to explore other possibilities that were outside of the traditional way in which the confession was put together is what I'm saying, I guess.
Right.
And so I think, the how does culture influence the process of, and who's more open to aligning the confession and scripture, our traditions, with what is the norm, what's becoming the cultural norm, so that we have the identification now with the women's issue, the racial issue, and now the sexual revolution with the revoice theology.
But here's a question I have for Dominic and Chortles. That, and again, I don't mean to diminish the PCA's footprint in American society, but I mean, and I don't think the OPC's is it's teeny tiny, obviously, that footprint, whatever the OPC's is, but it doesn't seem to me the PCA is a whole lot bigger, even though the PCA may think of itself as having much more access to cultural influencers. But aside from that, I wonder how much of this is a local matter. Say a congregation in a particular city or a particular neighborhood, for them to have the kind of standing they already have in that neighborhood, say whether it's Nashville or St. Louis, or even the Presbytery and the way it relates to that particular region of the country. So it's not so much that people in the PCA are thinking they're going to shape national discussions, but to hold on to that place that they have in their local setting, they need to do this. And I don't know if that makes any difference, but
yeah, I mean, the question is whether ministry to the city, capital T, capital C, trademark, do you have to have a certain kind of stance towards homosexuals and artists, and the cultural, the cultural leaders in arts and that sort of thing? I mean, many of them are homosexual, and if you're going to have a gallery walk or an art crawl, you're going to rub shoulders with the homosexuals who live there. And do you have to be able to take a stance like Revoice to reach those people? And of course, the bigger question is, are you reaching those people? But I just think that we have people who think contextualization requires these things. Dr. Aquila, what do you think about that?
Right, and no, I do. I again, in my experience and what I saw growing up in the Southern Presbyterian Church and was in it for a period of time. By the way, when I graduated from seminary, interestingly enough, I was called into to plant church in the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod in Virginia. And so that was my first taste of being in a non-PCUS group in the evangelical world, because I'd been Roman Catholic, then Presbyterian. And so all I knew was basically that history, and I saw what was taking place in the life of the PCUS. And so when I graduated from Reformed Seminary, I was in the fifth graduating class, third entering class, but fifth graduating class. We were still quite small. And so part of the reason why RTS was even founded in Jackson at Mississippi at the time was because Central Mississippi Presbytery was a safe presbytery where they could function without being bothered, and any professors they called could be members of that presbytery without any difficulty. If you went anywhere else, it would be impossible. So that means I graduated about a year and a half before the PCA started, but I attended the convocation of sessions and other meetings that were being held around the denomination that would eventually become the PCA. But going the other way, I I learned this history that Dr. Hart is talking about. And because the focus in the RPCES was fairly much comparable to where the OPC is, because when I went, after I finished planning that church, the OPs asked me to plant a church out in California. And I found the same mindset in terms of history, that there was always a backward glance to 1936. That was the defining moment. And so I used to jokingly say that there's nothing better than these two churches than see a few hearses pass by, so that we could start looking forward. But I consider myself an old school person, and so I wasn't interested in just saying that to move on. But I also believe that, having grown up in the PCUS, there was a culture there of growth and of evangelism and being being engaged in the community, but especially evangelistically. And so I didn't see that as a part of the ethos of the RPs. I still remember one time going to the one of my first early presbyteries in Delmarva Presbytery, and the report. So here was this I-95 corridor from Delaware all the way down to Virginia. That's beginning to really grow. You could actually drive through on 95 in Washington, D.C. without going through a lot of traffic back in those days. And but you could tell this is going to be a major, major corridor of growth that's going to take place. And I'm coming with that background that if you see something growing, then let's plant a church here and plant a church there and do that. So the missions guy, whoever's chairman of the missions committee's report, was as long as it took for him to stand up and say, "I have no report, Mr. Moderator," and he'd sit down. And so one time I just stood up and said, guys, we need to realize that we're in this vast corridor and all these people are here. What can we do to see them as a mission field? And the chairman stood up and said, "Mr. Moderator, I nominate him to be chairman of the committee." And we were sort of loosey-goosey. And I said, "No, I didn't ask for that." Well, anyway, I went ahead and took it, and we did begin to plant churches, and most of them are still in existence. Of course, with the joining and receiving, they're part of the PCA now. But the point is that there wasn't that sense about it. And I jokingly said to the guys, you guys would probably want to get one. Let's see. Instead, you would rather get one person to leave the PCUSA than to get 10 new converts. And they would say, "When your point?" I said, and they said, "This is not good. We need to begin to change our orientation and a little bit." And so things began to happen, and I believe that, I guess at that point I showed my new side thing to sort of saying we can do evangelism and be strong Calvinist and without giving up the confession and accommodating to culture. So, but if you don't, then you become what we're talking about today with transformationalism, thinking that somehow the yearning of the heart is to return to Eden or to bring the new city, the city of God, forward to our time or back to our time. And so there's a utopian spirit within our hearts, and we're thinking that we can do it by the sheer power of our engaging culture, and that we're the ones who can make it happen. And I see that constantly, and trying to say, if we can reach these people, we can talk to them, they will come our way. And then history shows they really don't reach those people, at least not in a transformationalistic framework anyway. At least that's my experience.
I think there's a case to be made that transformationalism is sort of it's really just a kind of a fancier, more cultured revivalism in a way, and it has elements of the prosperity gospel. It also thinks that it can really clean things up and raise property values and all sorts of things that we typically that most churches don't have on their radar. What is the line that would go? I mean, we know why Machen left the PCUSA. At what point does the church reaffiliate or start thinking about it? Well, is it the gospel? Is it methodology? Is it politics? Is it cultural engagement? Is there a hard and fast line? Is there a formula for this?
If
Dr.
I can
Hart.
add to that question, just
Yeah,
to Dr. Hart about it, because of what he said about Gerstner, Gerstner as well, but it's for Machen, that it was your sense, Dr. Hart, that Machen really believed that he could stay and try and make a difference, and very much like John Gerstner seemed to also have said the same thing.
Right.
Have we missed something then between the spirit of those two men and their idea that because of like you said, the purity of the church, part of it, that we don't seem to have set in our hearts and minds as much?
Well, I mean, I guess I felt at times that Gerstner's arguments about the confession of faith in the PCUSA was almost totemic or sacramental, but in a magical way, that as long as you have that there, then the church really hasn't changed. And it didn't do justice to what was going on in the agencies of the church, in the courts of the church, et cetera. And when you're saying that in the context as well of other conservatives that may have left, and you could be lending support to those ministries, it might seem a little foolish. At least that's one level. But from the Machen perspective, and I think he shared this with Gerstner in a way, there wasn't an itching to get out. I've said before on this podcast that I can't believe that Machen went on for 16 years fighting liberalism in the PCUSA from 1920 until 1936. I did it for roughly 1 year in the CRC, and I couldn't take it. And thankfully, providentially, I moved from the Midwest to the East Coast and could switch churches at that point by virtue of a move. So, I don't know that there are easy grounds to leave. And I think you need to exhaust as many options you have for trying to reform within the structures that are there. And I mean, I've just been grading papers before coming on about the Civil War and secession of the South, and I bring this up in part because some historians have interpreted Machen as being a Southerner. He was a secessionist. It was built into his DNA, and so this was going to happen. But I actually think that, depending on how you look at the sectional crisis between 1830s and 1860s, it wasn't necessarily just an overnight switch that happened with the southern states wanting to secede, and that there were various remedies that they tried to pursue. They may have overreacted with the election of Lincoln, etc. But and then there become questions of whether, the union was such, the political union was such that you could never get out of it. We don't view the union of the church in that way. The stakes are higher for leaving the church. At the same time, we have a lot of different denominations and a number of different Reformed and Presbyterian communions, and we live with that lack of unity, even though there are means of fraternal relations among those churches, many of them. So, I think sometimes we can overestimate the idea of the unity of the church, even though, of course, it is in the creed. And at the same time, maybe the flip side or the opposite side is to look for ways to get out right away because you're so intent on the purity of the church. And as soon as the church takes that first strike, you're out of here. And there's something in between. And it does go a lot to the character of the people who are trying to reform the church. And it goes a lot to the structures of the church that allow for ongoing efforts to pull the church back from the error that you see in it.
Well, your point would be that Machen was very patient and long-suffering, much more than most.
Or much more than people have thought. That there's more patience there than people. It's as if this was 1861 all over again. He was just itching for that one shot on Fort Sumter, and then boom. I don't think that was the case.
Do you think? We've talked a lot about, Machen and leaving and whatnot as an ordained man. Would you kind of prescribe the same advice to, say, a layman who was thinking about the same thing, or sort of weighing those options?
Probably.
Okay.
And again, it would depend on the character of the congregation, character of the session,
and your own family situation.
Right. Yeah. These are all prudential matters, unless, of course, your conscience is being bound. And I do think that conscience is very important. And if you think you're doing something, forced to do something contrary to God's word, that's grounds for at least. I think, though, before you leave, you do have to make people aware that that's the case. If you can't convince them, you appeal to a higher judicatory and appeal again to another judicatory. And if you still don't get relief, then you're faced with the situation of possibly having to leave. But on the other side of all this, even though it may sound like I'm being far more of a gradualist and maybe more of a, say, a conservative about this as grounds for staying as long as possible, as someone who looks on at the PCA and sees what has gone on for the last 25 years, I'm truly alarmed by those developments. And I have the luxury of not having to worry about it, at least as far as being in it. It's not a luxury for the OPC in the sense that we have fraternal relations with the PCA, and we actually co-own a publishing endeavor, Great Commission Publications. So, I don't know that the Reformed Church world is going to collapse if Great Commission Publications went under, because the PCA and OPC severed ties in some way. But there are things that keep the two churches together. And so that's one reason for someone in the OPC looking on to see what's happening to see is how we can maintain this joint endeavor with Great Commissions. And it's another reason for also making the point that I think conservatives in the PCA have all sorts of reasons for being concerned.
Let me ask Dr. Aquila, is it better to be run off than to slink off?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the word slink. I would say that you take a principled position where you do set the bar at different places, or where the line in the sand is. Let's use that phrase. And what is it you believe it's crossed the line, that you believe that you just can't, of conscience, if it is of that, or for the sake of overall ministry, in terms of how you are not able to fully support the work of the church, the wider church of the denomination. So you're constantly fighting against it and withholding your funds and redirecting them in other ways. So I would say that there comes a time when you can say this far and no farther, and I do think you reach that point. I think part of the reason why the PCA, going back to the groups that were being cobbled together, in each individually, by the way, there was no structural plan. No one set out and laid out a big plan of, okay, let's start this group, this group, this group. They all emerged in response to what they saw in the life of the church. And so, as I think I've shared on this program before, that Reformed Seminary actually came out of that article in 1963 in the Presbyterian Survey, when Sam Patterson, who was then president of French Camp Academy in Mississippi, which is a school for children from broken homes, and was a long time owned and operated by the Synod of Mississippi, read those article, and he had been hearing all these things, but he was also an evangelist, and he traveled a circuit. He was very popular in Mississippi and other parts of the South, and so he heard what was happening, but he wasn't in groups and in circumstances where he was feeling the pressure points until he read that article. And then that disturbed him, because he was really committed to the concept of the authority of Scripture. And if you don't have the Scripture, you don't have evangelism. And he was evangelist at heart. And so he drove down to Jackson and met with some elders in some of the larger churches down there. And out of that came the concept of the Reformed Theological Institute. And that's when Morton Smith, who was then teaching at Westminster Seminary, was asked to come and lead that. And so he moved to Kosciuszko, which is in the central Mississippi, and he flies his own plane. And so he started Bible studies one night in Memphis, the next night would be in Birmingham, the next night would be in Jackson, and he could fly to those places. And after about 3 years of doing that, and he had attracted there was a large group and a high interest that came out of that, they realized that, okay, we're reaching large groups, but and trying to bring a sense of the Scripture, integrity of Scripture, and Reformed theology, but you're dealing with something that doesn't have any structure to it. And that's when they said, well, let's move it from an institute to a seminary. And that's when Reformed Seminary then was birthed in 1966. And it came out of that whole movement that started with that article. Because Sam, whether Reform would eventually have come about anyway, it probably wouldn't have had the history it did have if the article hadn't appeared in Presbyterian Survey about questioning the infallibility of Scripture, and Sam Patterson was the kind of individual he was. He, by the way, was like Machen and Gerstner. Morton Smith became the first stated clerk while he was still on the faculty of PCA, while he was still on the faculty at RTS. And that created a lot of disturbance, because almost all of the all the professors were PCUS, and here was now this movement. And so the faculty meetings were quite interesting. And but Patterson eventually resigned as president when he saw that he wasn't able to keep professors and students in the PCUS, and he felt that he had exhausted his ability to do that, and he lived in a trailer. His wife had passed away, and he was a man of very simple means and didn't want a lot. And he had a caravan, a trailer, and he just moved it back up to Kosciuszko French camp and lived there the rest of his life. But he stayed in the U.S. Church, PCUS all his life, and then even when it became PCUSA. So he felt that he had lost the war because he couldn't keep people, and couldn't keep the PCA from starting, and couldn't keep people and his own faculty out of the PCA.
Well,
So
let me ask you this. Let me ask Dr. Hart. Well, I mean, it seems obvious to me that some of Machen's reason for trying to reform the church and hang on was concern for those he knew would have to remain in the Northern Church. There were many small churches and marginal churches that maybe didn't have the luxury to leave or didn't have the will, but he knew there were believers in those churches. And when good churches leave, then there's an effect on the churches that don't go with them. Do you have a sense that he was concerned for people like that?
I do. I'm not sure how much more to put that. I don't remember it being a prominent thing. I mean, once the OPC left, there were a lot of articles, and this goes back to the point that Dominic made about the OPC looking to the past and valuing members leaving the PCUSA to join with the OPC rather than new converts. But there were lots of articles written by George Marsden's father, Robert, about sort of answering the questions of why you wouldn't leave, when you should leave, etc. So there was very much an eye on trying to bring the conservatives in the PCUSA out. And they were very much unsuccessful. As was, it should be said, those who did stay in, people like McCartney, I mean, they pretty much kind of died off and lost any kind of real influence or place within the church other than at the congregational level and, being a member of a presbytery. So I do think there is that concern. And, I know people in the URC who have watched what's happened in the CRC and know that there are still conservatives in the CRC and know that they're still they're having to put up with more and more of what the church is doing. But at a certain point, you can't worry about all of those people. I mean, they have to make up their minds themselves. If they're getting support from the denomination, for instance, financially for a church plant or something, that of course makes it difficult. And to try to give them get sort of reassurance that they'll have the same kind of support if they leave is probably something very difficult to do. But if I could just take this opportunity now, even though I'm not directly addressing your question, but something I was thinking about in the comments that were made, especially even in relation to last week's episode. I think, Chortles, you said something about the lack of awareness in the PCA about Revoice, that you thought there were many people who didn't know about it. And one of the things that was truer in 1920s and 1930s, even though it wasn't effective, but there were magazines that reached a lot of ministers and members of the church. But there were also times when Machen, who was a wealthy man, worked with others to just write pamphlets and send them out to every single congregation and elder in the church about a certain matter. And I mean, in some ways, it would be easier to do that now with social media and email. You wouldn't have to pay all the postage and whatnot if you got email addresses, et cetera, of people. But the idea of communicating more to people about matters that are going on in the church, it's very easy for people in the pew And for elders, even as you've had various shows about the lack of elder presence at General Assembly, it's very easy for people in a congregation only to look at what's going on in the congregation, and even occasionally maybe what's happening at Presbytery, and not really know what's going on in the agencies of the church that are overseen by the General Assembly. So, part of a strategy for thinking about what to do is greater communication, and a much more concerted way, rather than the websites and the conferences and even the podcasts that are out there, but trying to get something directly into people's inboxes or even their hands. I don't know where that stands.
Well, ironically, we have the ability to communicate, but we're competing, and I'm not saying we, but any one voice is competing with 50,000 others.
Yeah, I was going to
now.
say, I think the postage idea might be the most effective way to do it at this point. If you could package it correctly, or especially with everybody being home, everyone's already excited to get stuff in the mail or get stuff delivered. Why not air mail? Why not airdrop in some red flags or something?
Could you attach it to a mail-in ballot somehow?
Could we deliver it by drone?
And yet we have there are elements in the PCA, and there's an overture to this effect to regulate the social media usage of elders. Now, that may be the motives behind that may be as pure as the wind-driven snow.
We need common sense social media reform.
But one wonders. Machen caught flack for some of his publications and pronouncements, certainly. Dr. Aquila is no stranger to this. This might be a time, Doctor, for you to tell us about some of your media forays.
Well, the cancel culture before we had that term was already existent. But I think it goes back to something that Dr. Hart said. You start out, almost your first comment to mention the mission, the Board for Presbyterian Missions, and that was one of the things that, from Machen's point of view, he did it. And I'm going to tie that in with what Chortles just said. But just to pick up on that is that he was really being charged with going outside the church and starting that mission board. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
All right. See, and so that was an attempt to cancel culture or canceling of something. What was it that was present in the PCUSA that could give a Presbyterian General Assembly the right to say what a man could do in setting up, his own mission board?
It was pretty wide open, actually. There were a number of evangelical faith mission organizations that had a place, not officially in the PCUSA, but that nobody was saying you shouldn't participate in these. And so there was all sorts of interdenominational activity going on back to the Second Pretty Good Awakening and the New School presence in those. But even the Claire Davis for many years would talk about the provisions for the Calvinist Methodist Church having its own separate agency, even though it had been folded into the PCUSA in roughly 1920, but that they still had their own mission agency, and maybe even their own home missions agency as part of the terms of the merger. So the PCUSA was by no means consistent on what they would allow or not. But in Machen's case, it was designed to be a direct threat, and so they took it that way. The other ones, maybe they didn't see as threatening, even though when it came to money, if all that money that people sent to those other missions agencies had gone into the board of foreign missions, they would have had more money to send out more missionaries. So there was a kind of competition, but Machen's was much more direct.
Yeah, in other words, they found a way of finding something in their book of order that said that this was a chargeable matter because you were going against the church by creating that mission.
Right.
And when you were told not to do it.
Although it's a really long story, the short version is that in 1934, the General Assembly had a committee that gave a ruling that the independent board was illegal. And one of Machen's constant complaints was he was found guilty before he was even given a trial. And that became the basis for trying the members of the independent board, that 1934 ruling. And to make it a short answer longer, but even Leonard Trinnerud, who wrote the colonial history of Presbyterianism, published in the late 1940s. I can't remember which seminary he taught at, but he was in the PCUSA, a church historian. He wrote a report in the late 40s which indicated that perhaps that 1934 mandate against the independent board may not have been actually constitutional. But it was
that's what I'm saying is
language.
So they had to come up with something, and they came up with that because they didn't charge him with creating an independent seminary, Westminster.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so that to me would have been more of a challenge because it was actually producing ministers going into the USA ministry.
Right.
Yeah, and there was the precedent with Union, I guess it was, that was
That allowed for it.
Already
but going back to
independent.
then, just in the same sense, though, that the challenge is that we have is that the tendency is that, as I see it, is conservatives tend to be open to rational and reasonable discussion and different ways of communicating the truth, and open to ideas, and we're not afraid of it. So, in other words, more light and more speech is good. I think the other side tend to be more restrictive, and they don't like to be challenged, and they tend to be more, as I see it, authoritarian, or at least restrictive in what they are going to do. So back when we were having the debate in the early 2000s about federal vision and new perspective, that if you challenged anybody, if you wrote an article, it was on your blog or it was published in some other usually internet media, or if it was even published in hard copy, that you would be challenged if you went against the prevailing view of someone who claimed to be holding federal vision and new perspective, that you violate the Ninth Commandment because you didn't go talk with them first, and which was a sort of a novel idea. And the idea really was not so much that you didn't talk with them, it's just they didn't want to be, they wanted the liberty to be able to say whatever wanted to be said and teach it without being disturbed. It came to the point where in 2009 or something, we had on the Quill Report, we were just a brand new thing. We started in May of 2008. I ran a review article written by someone who was not in the PCA, reviewing some things of a minister in the PCA. And the title he gave it, and I kept it, is Roman Catholic Tendencies in the Presbyterian Church in America. And it was a review of a number of published documents of a minister, and he highlighted it. And it was very well written, and it was well sourced, and it was a interesting thing. Well, some of the younger ministers, fairly newly ordained in Metro New York Presbytery, brought a motion to the floor of their presbytery to send a motion, a question, an issue of an investigation to my presbytery at the time, saying that I had violated the Ninth Commandment and they need to investigate it. Of course, the way our book is written, it says if some report comes in, the court should do it. So I said to my court, you investigate. Did I violate the Ninth Commandment in publishing this review article? And fortunately, my The committee that examined it said, well, it was in the public. It was something in the public domain. The expectation is if you publish something, most likely it can be reviewed. And if you don't want it reviewed, don't publish. And there was nothing. And plus the fact I didn't write it anyway. It was just that I had run the review. And so the unanimous decision of the committee that then they brought to the floor of the Presbytery and we debated, and Presbytery adopted it unanimously, was to answer Metro New York Presbytery by saying they're there because of all these reasons that were just given. But that was the first indication of trying to close down, the attempt to shut down something. And it almost could have been, that's the reason I'm glad you said what you did, Dr. Hart, about that 1934 assembly, where they came up with this ruling of saying that the independent board, because of whatever the reasons were, was against the church, and it was against the good order of the church. Well, that's what really was being attempted, I think. Now, two different areas, but in the same level,
Right.
I think. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we are experiencing. And if you try and say anything, then you're questioning someone's integrity, as opposed to saying, look, we're dealing with an issue. Let's deal with it theologically. Let's deal with it confessionally. Let's have the ability to discuss whether something is right in the life of the church because of our history, our theology, and so forth. And it's hard to get that done without people taking things personally. And when you take it personally, then it looks like you're doing something of a personal offense, which is not intended.
Well, let's talk about some of the dangers as we wrap up. The dangers of reaffiliation or just leaving with no good place to go. It seems to me that sometimes when churches leave, they become independent for a time, and some of them stay independent. And they're no longer Presbyterian. So that's one possible issue. It also, it breaks up presbyteries. It would be nice if churches left a denomination, if they could leave as presbyteries in some cases. And I believe there were some cases of that in the formation of the PCA, where you had some presbyteries where almost all the churches in that presbytery left. And so they didn't lose anything in terms of oversight and fellowship that you get in presbytery. You also are going to make yourself much smaller. Some churches, if they left the PCA, for instance, would become very isolated. They might be 150 or 200 miles from the nearest church if they form some small denomination. That's certainly an issue. And it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work to form a new denomination, and it can be a lot of work to reaffiliate. The reexamination, the research required, there's just nothing desirable, I guess, unless you're a certain kind of entrepreneur or it's not that important to you. It's a big deal to leave, and it brings big problems with it. The PCA started with a reasonable number, but it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't be very difficult to start something new. And we know that we understand total depravity. There are no perfect churches. The OPC's unofficial moniker, the only perfect church, notwithstanding, not really completely true. I'm sure I don't know if Dr. Hart knows, but Dr. Quilla has done a lot of supply in the OPC.
Yes.
In Florida in recent years. So what do you guys think about the dangers and the trials and the travails and the possible pitfalls of leaving a denomination?
Well, in thinking about the URC, and which has come up here earlier, and it's a more recent one. It's taken the URC a while, and they're still struggling to find a denominational level identity. And I should be very careful about saying denomination, because they are explicitly, intentionally a federation of congregations and not a denomination. And that also cuts down then on creating the structures that akin to what they used to have in the Christian Reformed Church. Another wrinkle in it too is, and this is part of the DNA in the OPC in a way, and also true of churches that leave in the Scottish tradition of Presbyterianism. If you regard yourself as the continuing remnant of the older body, so you're the true PCA. So if you leave and you become the continuing PCA, it makes it harder for for you to relate to other Presbyterian communions, or even to think about maybe affiliating with other Presbyterian communions, because you're holding on to the attributes, the distinct features of the denomination out of which you've come, which are oftentimes historical as much as anything else. So people who still regard 1973
Three.
as the moment that they want to hold on to, in the same way that the OPC wants to hold on to 1936, that can also limit your ministry, but can also limit how you're going to relate to other Presbyterian churches that are out there. It doesn't necessarily address whether it's easier or harder to create other sorts of structures that go with a Presbyterian communion. But, I think overall, Chortles, your point that it's hard to do this is correct. And another reason why it should be a last resort.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That it's just no easy way. I know that part of the problems that when we left the PCA, when the PCA was formed, and trying to it started out as the initial name was the Continuing Presbyterian Church, just until they could settle on a name. And so they did see themselves as being distinctly Southern and having all that history and so forth. But they assumed that one of the problems was that it was such a central control, top-down hierarchical Presbyterianism, that they said, let's create the grassroots. And that became one of the bywords of the PCA, grassroots Presbyterianism. And so we're going to, grow from the bottom up and make the local church the center, of which then your regional body with the presbyteries, and then the national with the General Assembly. And that's part of the reason why the General Assembly, they said each of the committees and agencies will be responsible, instead of having a central treasury, to raise their own support. And so we imported almost like a independent missionary model of raising, you have to go out itinerate and raise your own money and create your public. And so you were under the General Assembly, but you have to go raise your own money, and there's no central pot from which you're going to draw from. And so that left things sort of a little bit more open. So that really did solve the problem, because we're still having those same problems. So, but we think we remedy it, and the remedy doesn't last, for long on that. So.
Well, let me suggest a couple of things. If a group were to leave the PCA, I think becoming another micro-denomination should not be the goal, or even becoming another PCA-sized denomination. I think, and I don't advocate leaving, but I think the synod concept is helpful. The ARP, for example, calls themselves a synod because they realize they should reaffiliate with like-minded churches, so they don't call themselves a General Assembly. That's my understanding. Maybe as a I think you would view anything new as a transitional thing to affiliating with another existing denomination, or maybe even coming under some sort of oversight of an existing NAPARC denomination, and saying, we may not be able to join you today, but we hope to one day. We look for the future. I think that's one thing that could be helpful, because we don't want to become less Presbyterian and less connected. But I think I would predict that if what we might call the conservatives and confessionalists left the PCA in numbers, that the PCA would not be long for NAPARC, and certainly the future of any group that broke away would be with what remained of NAPARC. I think one of the most disturbing things in the early iterations of the 2010 strategic plan was the idea of leaving NAPARC was floated, because we just didn't have anything in common with all those squares. That was more or less said, and that rubbed a lot of us the wrong way. I'm sure Dr. Aquila remembers those tumultuous days in 2010.
Mm-hmm. General assemblies would go till 2 a.m. in the morning, a couple of nights a week. Yeah. Yep. So there were long fights. Just one other thing, I don't want to get off on a total different tangent too far, but I'm just running by Dr. Hart. One of the contentions that I make is that in the 1920s, when the conservative wing of the PCUSA finally felt like they won something with McCartney being elected moderator, and that's when they were able to develop, the response to Fosdick with the, what fundamentalism, contrary to his views, out of which, if I believe this is correct, then the Auburn Affirmation came because it was in response to that General Assembly. Is that correct?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And so what happened is, I think they felt, look, we really won at a General Assembly level, and we thought that it was good. But after McCartney, really and after that, the statement on fundamentalism, nothing really happened structurally any longer. I mean, the levers of power were driven, and controlled by the liberals. So one of the things that I have suggested is that we need to make sure that we understand that structure is important, and that we need to oversee it and maintain it, hold it accountable in a healthy way, without stifling it and suffocating it, as well as our ministry. Because what I observed growing up in the Southern Church was the men who eventually became the ones who promoted the PCA's development and then became the first real leaders of it, the fathers of it, were very busy growing their local churches, ministering in their local communities, having an impact in their local areas. And so they didn't have time to go to the synod. Back then, the U.S. church had synods as well. So you had Presbytery Synod and General Assembly. And they didn't want to do things too much outside of the local church because they saw substance, they saw growth, they saw people, evangelism and growth, the teaching going on. So the liberals who don't go to the scriptures, they get their National Council of Churches annual sermon book and they preach through those things. They don't do their exegesis of work. They just preach their little ditties from that. And so they have all the time for the mechanism and the dealing with the machinery of the church, so to speak. And so they take it over, and we just let it happen because that's not our shtick. We don't want to spend time doing those things. We really are engaged in ministry that we think is being productive in our local area. So it's the structure versus ministry, and how do we work to really combine those things in a way that we can hold ourselves accountable in every kind of way.
All right, then I think another thing that the PCA should keep in mind was that just like an old church building is kind of hard to sell, it's considered a liability in some cases. There aren't other NAPAR denominations that are ringing, that are just tingling with excitement at the prospect of 70 or 80 PCA churches jumping in with them. It's like they maybe at one time you were the good-looking girl in the school, and everybody wanted to date you, but all of a sudden the next year nobody does. I know. I mean, I've talked to people in other denominations, and they think, it would be disruptive if all these crazy PCA people wanted to join our denomination next year. We sort of got things going the way we want them to go, and that's something to consider. It's just like you don't want to leave a job unless you have a job to go to. It's just very difficult to leave a denomination and a church, but there's no discounting. I mean, even today, it was either today or yesterday, it hit the PCA General Assembly website. There's a proposal for a study committee on white supremacy. So it's out there, and we're going to have to vote on that. And we have Revoice. We have a real push for at this point. Well, it's not legislative, but there are what amount to female officers in many PCA churches, and I think there's more to come on that front. So we have the homosexual issues, the women's issues, and the racial issues. And I think for a lot of people among us, it's hard to be patient and deal with those things, which are so political, so cultural, so trendy. And, I think of the last lines of Christianity and liberalism. Maybe some of us are just escapists. We want to flee those issues when we go to church, but some seem to want to sanctify them and drag them in the front door of the church and put them up front. So as we sort of wrap up, both of you esteemed doctors, we'll call you. What do you? How can a denomination survive such a divisive and charged issues?
Well, it seems to me, I'll just jump in, looking on from the outside and following the news as best I can, that a lot of the controversy is coming at the local level from what congregations or presbyteries are doing, that at the denominational level, the agencies of the General Assembly, whether it's in education or home missions or foreign missions, that it doesn't feel like there's a top-down effort to force congregations, presbyteries to follow a certain line set in Atlanta, for instance. So it's much more somebody doing something over here, and they want the General Assembly maybe to endorse this.
Well, it's cities versus rural and suburbs in some cases.
Right.
Yeah,
but
so
General Assembly,
it's local to that extent, yes.
Right. And General Assembly becomes the mechanism by which sort of those rival groups gain the affirmation of the denomination. The General Assembly has to make a call on some of these matters, whether to have this study committee, whether to try to hear an overture or hear a case, a disciplinary case over somebody doing something with women in office or homosexual matters. But so there's just seems to me there's a great variety, not a shared understanding of ministry, and that there is one there, but then there are a lot of other things that go with it, depending on where it's happening. So it feels like a fragmented church without the structures necessarily to adjudicate those fragmentations very well. I don't know if that's fair or not, and I think that's very different from, say, the PCUSA in the 1920s and 1930s, when I think the General Assembly was asserting itself more and more into at least the way money went in the church, and that affected congregations and presbyteries. So it's especially daunting then to think about how to gain some kind of sense of the common in the church and what's going to be a common enterprise. Although you already have it. You have it in your constitution. You have it in your confession and catechisms. You have it in the Word of God. You have it in the hymn book that the PCA has put together. But there are all these elements, backbones of a common endeavor. And I mean, my question always is, but I'm a spirituality of the church person. Why isn't that stuff good enough for the church? If people want to do other things in their community, about some of these other matters, go ahead. You don't have to do it with the blessing of the church. You can do it as just an ordinary American, but people want to fuse the two together in some way.
Dr. Quill, I wrote the article for you about kind of a warning that division was possible, because I didn't want the division to occur. So what's your perspective on what ought to happen and what may happen?
I agree with Dr. Hart. What he was saying just at the end here is that we should do everything we can to work not let it happen. I think of the old song I grew up with, there are 50 ways to leave your lover. We just never know where we are in that. And Wiersbe, that would be a good way to exit the song tonight if you had that come up, but we really care. We care for the church. We love it. That's the reason we stay with it. That's the reason we fight it. That's the reason we fuss with one another. It's a big family thing where you fuss with family members, but you love each other. And that's because this is the only family we've got. And so can we find that place where we can get along and really love one another and find that joint common ground. And so being an old school person, I would say that, the thing that gives us our concreteness and the foundation is our confessional stance. And therefore that's uniform. It's throughout the whole church. And, but the application of our ministry, it comes differently because of our different locations. So, so I guess what I'm saying mostly then is it's never going to be easy. I've already been by virtue of where I was called, in the PCUS, the RPCES, the OPC, and now the PCA. And so really PCA is coming back to some of at least the roots of the OPCUS. And in each one of those, I enjoyed things. I saw the flaws, but there were good things that appreciated, grew in. I think it developed me in a fuller kind of way. But the thing it confers more than anything else is that we have an assurance. People usually tend to ask what my favorite hymn is, and I'm not sure if it's because of the music, but at least the title is "How firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is gained for your faith in His excellent word." And that's where I think, we're rooted in that. Of course, we say sola scriptura, and that's the only thing that we really have in the life of the church to give to a needy world, both to those who are outside of Christ and need to hear about Him. That is the word. And for those who are in the church to grow up in Christ and be conformed to Him. And that focus of ministry in that sense will bind us together. I think we make it, but we start beginning to get out and looking at all the evil and so forth. And instead of seeing the gospel as the answer, we come up with all sorts of things that eventually crash and burn. And then church does too.
We love the church because Christ loves it. Mm-hmm. And any love that we can muster is because Christ has first loved us. So I hope our love for the church, all four of us, has been evident, and we would encourage everyone to love your local church, to attend it as you can, and to pray for the peace and the purity of whatever denomination you happen to be in. Any of us who are in a Presbyterian or Reformed church are in so much better a situation than many are, who are sort of lost sheep in the wilderness. So a sense of proportion is helpful. Well, I thank both of you, Dr. Aquila and Dr. Hart. Only his wife calls him Dr. Hart. I know he requires that, but we'll try to keep up that standard. And I believe, you're always welcome here. And Resby, I think he'll say goodnight to everyone. Read the Aquila Report. Go to oldlife.org and do follow the Aquila Report on Facebook and Twitter, and Dr. Hart at Old Life on Twitter. And I'm sure he's got 2 or 3 books in the works that we haven't even heard about yet. And he has his own podcast, the Paleo Protestant Podcast, and it's quite good. Sometimes I think, I'm not going to like this one, and then I listen to it, and it's pretty good anyway. So, and I'm trying to get you some real bumper music, and maybe
I know.
On the next one, I'll put it in there whether you want it or not.
That would be one way to do it.
All right, Resby, are you? I see you're muted. There, you're unmuted. You're ready to add your 2 cents and say whatever you want to say. You have the last word, as always.
Well, you took both of my 2 pennies that I was going to say. You basically plugged everything there was to plug.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to miss it,
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to our guests. Cue the music. Don't be an Erdman.
I need heartache for every mother that I must grow. I'm not much nearer heaven's city and my eternal home. Oh, heaven's gates are standing open. I see them standing open wide. I know there's joy and glory waiting. Oh, how I long to get inside. I'll never shed a tear in heaven. I'll never grieve. I'll never part. For when I leave this world of sorrow, I'll leave it all behind. I'll leave it all behind.
On the